Hello, everyone, and welcome to our unit on race and ethnicity. So, I'd first like to give you all just a few moments to pause and reflect. What have you taken away from the readings so far in this course and for today's class that have to do specifically with this idea of race? What have you learned from those readings? Or how would you define race today, right now? I'm going to give you a few moments to pause this video and answer those two questions in your notes. Again, what did you learn from today's readings on race? And how would you define race? Okay. So, one of the pieces that I had you look at for our meeting today was a short history of racial categories in the US Census. You'll see that I've included here in the slide a timeline. So, this is a timeline that's noting all the different categories, racial categories used or offered in US censuses from 1790 up to 2020. You'll notice generally, well, I guess I could ask you, what do you notice? What do you notice about this chart here? One thing, of course, is that the number of categories or options over time has greatly increased. You'll notice that some categories or options, like Mexican, came and went, were only there for a very short period of time, one particular census, right? Um, how many of you from pre 1800 to 2020 might have occupied a different racial category if you lived in another time period? So, again, look at the racial categories offered today and then go back to, let's say, 1900. Would you feel like, or do you feel like there's a category that fits you there, or the early 1800s, right? And how is that problematic? Okay, something to consider. Mexican, for example, is an ethnicity I just mentioned that a moment ago, that was included in the 1930 census, but taken off very shortly after. This is, of course, in part because Mexican is a nationality, less ethnicity. You'll also see 1940 that Hindu was included as a category. But of course, Hinduism is a religion. Hindu is a religious identity, not an ethnic one. And for those of you watching this video who might identify as white, note that this category has been historically used as the only category that fits people, say, from Lebanon, or some Egyptians and Iranians might identify as white over some of the other categories that are available. Although I believe actually that Middle Eastern will be added to the census coming up. But the point here is that to show you that racial categories are constructed, right? That these categories that we use as identities and that construct the way that we think of ourselves as ethnic and racial beings are informed by broader structural bureaucratic systems. In this case, say the census that is created by nation states, right? Um, So here is the definition that I'm giving you for ethnic group for our course. This is going to be a group distinguished by having cultural similarities. They have a shared set of values, beliefs, norms, a common language, a history, religion, and or race. So note that, the racial aspect here, like you don't necessarily have to share a racial identity to be part of an ethnic group. Um, um, Jewish, for example, is an interesting case study because, of course, it's a religion, it's a religious identity, but it's also an ethnic identity, right? Um, and hence why the example of religion is in there so useful. Race is an ethnic group that is incorrectly assumed to have a biological basis. Again, it's an ethnic group that's assumed, right? We assume we lump people into different races, and we assume based on the way they appear that because they appear that way, that they must have some sort of shared biological basis or origins. That's what most of my lecture is going to be about, is kind of deconstructing this idea of race as a valid biological concept. In US popular culture, race and ethnicity are used interchangeably. Most likely, many of you think that they came to this course thinking that they mean the same thing. But for us as anthropologists, that's not the case. We don't use them interchangeably, they refer to two very different things. Humans tend to understand race as something that's biological or natural, right? That we understand people as being born into these very neat little boxes that you're either this or you're that in terms of racial identity. But that is, again, as I will note in just a few minutes, not the case. Do you remember what this image represents? It says Morgan's model. It's referring to Lewis Henry Morgan. This is a picture representing cultural evolutionism, right? And this problematic or false idea that all cultures are going to evolve from small groups of hunter gatherers to brought, to civilizations, right? In this over time, if everything works out, that they should indeed kind of evolve or develop up to civilization. As I mentioned before in class, you'll note that in this case, civilization, these early armchair anthropologists, for the most part, their ideas of civilization just happen to look like their societies, right? So, in case London is like a source of civilization, whereas hunter gatherers were somehow less evolved. And I just wanted to note that one of the things that's problematic with this theory of cultural evolutionism is, of course, that racism is baked into it, right? It's deeply intertwined with the origins of the discipline of anthropology, in that there's this very early problematic theory essentially argued that civilization is found in the land of white people, right? Again, this is something that we as cultural anthropologists find incorrect and very problematic. So, as I've sort of alluded to already, um, in contemporary anthropology, we understand race to be a social construct. We understand that race is not a simple, a neat, clear, easy biological category. Right? So, some of you might be thinking, what's he talking about? Come on, like, clearly race is biological, right? It's in something you inherit. We have humans look very different from one another. That's a simple fact, and that is absolutely true. But it's important to note that in terms of our genes, for example, there's greater genetic variation within racial groups than between them. So, for example, we could take two people who most of us would read as, say, white, and you might find that their genes have are share less in common with one another than, say, if you take one of those white people and compare their genes to a black person. They might actually be more genetically related. There's a very good chance. Um, all humans, for the most part, share, it's 99 point something, I think 99, I can't remember the exact number, but of genetic makeup. So, in other words, the genetic difference is completely negligible. There is no one gene in our genome that scientists, physical or biological anthropologists, have found that links directly to race, right? These are concepts that we have quite simply sort of come up with, or made up over time, as I will describe later on in this lecture. Like all social identities, race is understood in terms of categories that are socially constructed. I will define that later. What is a social construct? But just know that race is something that's socially constructed, and ideas of race, racial categories, these boxes we use to describe ourselves and other people, they vary from one society to another. They're not universal. And that tells us that race is cultural, that it's a cultural construct. Has anyone heard of the one drop rule? This might be something you heard about in a US history course in high school, for example. It is a concept that comes to us from of the very particular racial ideologies that grew out of the United States and its history of chattel slavery. It's essentially the idea that if you had at least one black, excuse me, that if you had at least one ancestor of African descent, right, no matter how far back, if it was one grandparent, for example, that makes you black, a black person, right? Um, what's interesting about the one drop rule, and I have some videos that sort of explain the origins of it, but it doesn't work the other way around, right? Think of someone who has, um, let's say, three grandparents who all identify and would be read as African American, and they have one grandparent that's white. Right? That person is probably not going to identify as white, right? And if they did, someone would tell them, you're not white, right? You're wrong, right? Um, right. Maybe they would identify as biracial or mixed nowadays, right? But the point is that one drop rule is a long-standing historical phenomenon that comes out of, right, the history of slavery in the United States. Now, I want to add one more thing, kind of going back to this idea of variation and explaining race. So, to be clear, again, it's very obvious that humans are different from one another. These differences are called phenotypic variations. For example, skin color, hair texture, eye color, or invisible phenotypic traits like blood type, right? However, these phenotypes are spread out in ways that don't reflect clear racial groups. So typically, when we think of race, we focus on simply skin color. But what about hair texture, right? Um, if we were to think about racial categories in terms of simply hair texture, that would lead to a very different kind of understanding of racial mapping, right, in categories. We should also note that phenotypic variations, in other words, the differences we have between one another in our bodies, they're not always related to genetics or inheritance. For example, think of malnutrition, right? That's something that's simply environmental, right? So, one drop rule is something that is extremely um, arbitrary, right? The idea that you simply just because you have one ancestor who's African American, that makes you black instead of white, really speaks to the arbitrariness of the violent history and legacy of slavery. Let's take more kind of specific example of the origins, or sorry, not the origins, but what one drop rule might look like, and or how racial categories vary across cultural or national borders. So, former President Barack Obama, who identifies as black, if he was to move to South Africa, he would be identified as colored. By colored, I mean a term. This is a term that's used in South Africa to refer to biracial people, right? So whereas Obama, often self-identifies as black in America or is identified by others as black in America, would have a totally different race in South Africa. Let's take Trevor Noah, right, the popular comedian who's from South Africa. He's colored in South Africa, but when he moves to America, he becomes black, right? So even though both of these individuals have, a parent who is one parent who is African and another parent who is white European in the case of Trevor Noah, or white American in the case of Barack Obama, right? They have these different racial categories depending on what country they're in. I also want to note that identity is always, including racial identity, it's always more complicated than simply how you identify, because we're always read out by others or identified by folks out in public. One drop rule is an example of hypodescent, by which I mean that it's the automatic assignment of a child of mixed union, of mixed racial background, to the racial category that's understood to be subordinate. I put that in quotes, to the dominant racial group. In other words, this idea that if there's a child who's mixed, who's biracial, that society, the social rule, if it's not going to use this term biracial or mixed, it will go to whichever one has lower status in that society that has been discriminated against. So, as always, I will include this a link to this video in the comments box. So please go ahead and pause my lecture video and play Trevor Noah explains the craziness of the one drop rule, and I will continue this lecture into part two.